crisis today is not so much a crisis simply of workers earning enough more to pay their debts. If workers do get more salary in the United States, when they move into the middle class, the price of entry into the middle class in the United States is to go so deeply into debt to buy your own house, to buy an education to get a job, to buy a car to drive to your job, all on debt, that you have to work for the rest of your life paying off the bank. So on top of the exploitation of the employer that Marx talked about in Volume 1 is the exploitation of the creditors, the bankers, that he spoke about in World War III. This morning's speakers had a common theme, and it was how do we adopt Marxism to the modern world? He was an optimist, and Marx expected in his time that capitalism would lead to socialism. What he said was that capitalism actually was revolutionary because it had a historical destiny, and that was to free European society and free societies in other countries away from the consequences of feudalism, of the medieval conquest of the land that had produced a landed aristocracy in England that lived on land rent, that created a banking class that was purely parasitic, making loans either to governments to wage war, and then when they couldn't pay, privatizing public infrastructure and raising prices. And Marx thought that industrial capitalism basically was going to get rid of this. And he showed in his preface to Capital, he wrote a critique of political economy that was a summary of his longer 3-volume study, Theories of Surplus Value. And what Marx did to begin his study was review the history of economics from William Petty, Quenet in France, Adam Smith, John Stuart Mill, and he showed how all of these economists did not simply describe how the markets worked. That wasn't what they were trying to do. They were reformers. They wanted to change the context within which markets operated. Adam Smith went to France and he met the physiocrats who said the problem with France is the government, the royalty, the landed aristocrats take all the rent, and people have to pay such a high price for rent that we have a high price of bread, everything coming from the land is high priced. The solution is to tax the landlords. So Adam Smith, who is now represented as a symbol of free enterprise, was completely against free enterprise. Everything he wrote was a critique of free enterprise, a critique of markets. He said the landlords had no moral reason at all to inherit the lands that had been conquered by military force in the medieval period, and that bourgeois society in Europe should end up either socializing the land or taxing it. John Stuart Mill, by the mid-1848, said the same thing. Either the state should buy out all of the land, or it should tax away the rise in the land's value. By the time you had the Paris Commune in 1871, you'd already gone way beyond the 1848 revolutions. Marx didn't think very much of the 1848 revolutions because he said they've solved the problem of criticizing the landowners. They've solved the problem of criticizing the bankers, that was the Simonians in France, but they still haven't improved the conditions of labor. The question is, since Marx was such an optimist, and yet today we find that capitalism is in crisis. Professor Romer has given a very good summary of the degree to which today's society is polarizing. It's not only polarizing, it's being reduced to austerity. Economies are shrinking, and I'll get more into that later. The economy is shrinking much more than the statistics actually integrate. So the question is, if things have turned out so different from what Marx expected, if capitalism has not become revolutionary, if it's produced austerity, was Marx right or wrong? Well, the fact is, when you read his analysis of how capitalism operates, his analysis is very applicable today. You have in Marx's, in volumes 2 and 3 of Capital, Marx discussed the nature of land rent, and he discussed especially finance capital. He pointed out that banking and finance increase not because of the means of production. They're not rounded into the means of production. If you owe money at a rate of interest, the money continues to grow interest whether or not the debtor can afford to pay. That's what you're finding in America with defaults. 10 million American families have defaulted on their mortgages. The same thing you found in Ireland, you're finding it in Greece. So you're finding a kind of reduction to austerity now, and yet all of this can be analyzed in terms of Marx's exposition of value theory. Value, price, and rent. Prices, Marx said, are much higher than actual cost value. And they're higher because of what he called fictitious costs, or unnecessary costs. He said there is no necessity for people who rent houses to pay a rent to the landlord. You don't need a landlord class. And he called them the excrescences of production. The same thing with bankers. He said the task of capital, industrial capitalism, would be to take banking out of the medieval feudal era, and instead of making predatory loans to consumer loans, to force them into bankruptcy, instead of making loans to governments, banking would become industrialized, and for the first time in history, banks, according to Marx, would lend to finance the creation of new capital goods, to build factories, to build means of production. And in his day, this was actually occurring in Germany. When World War I broke out, there was a great debate that occurred among English economists. They worried that England and the Allies might lose World War I because, they said, Germany and the central powers of Europe, Middle Europe, has a productive financial system that can finance industry, whereas the British financial system, like the American system, the Anglo-American system, basically is asset stripping. It makes loans simply to extract dividends, to get as much money out of the factory as it can, and to use all of the accumulated interest that it gets to make new loans on more and more shaky bubble-type projects. And the result is that England and America had a failed system. Well, despite this financial difference, the Allies won World War I, not the Central Powers, and with that loss, there was a whole change in the politics of the world, the organization of finance, and as Professor Romer said today, in the character of the socialist parties and the labor parties. Today, one finds the socialist and labor parties of Greece, Europe, the Democratic Party in the United States, arguing for austerity. It's amazing, how can parties claiming to represent the working class say what we need are lower wages, what we need are higher taxes on us, and untax the 1%? How does it come that they vote so much against their self-interest? I think we have to realize that, and I will have an explanation. What Marx wrote was that the debts tend to grow independently of the economy's ability to pay, and the financial sector grows faster than the industrial sector itself. In Germany, you had the analysis of finance capital as opposed to industrial capital, and this became the basis of Lenin's imperialism also, focusing on this difference. I'm going to argue in the time that's left to me that what we're seeing today in the West is not industrial capitalism. It's the failure of industrial capitalism, a lapse back into finance capitalism that is represented as the post-industrial society, as if it's somehow gone forward, gone beyond industrialism. But what it really is a pre-industrial society. It's a kind of neo-feudalism almost. You have not only a polarization of the economy, such as Piketty described and others, but you have the immiseration, and certainly Marx talked about immiseration, but the immiseration, the misery, the poverty is not occurring for the reasons that Marx wrote about. He devoted volumes 2 and 3 of Capital to analyzing rent and interest. The theory of rent was certainly picked up in China by Sun Yat-sen that said, we have a landlord class here that's just as burdensome for China as Europe's landlord class, and we have to solve that problem because of the landlords are ending up with the wealth. And especially in volume 3, Marx analyzed interest, and he, more than any other economist of his day, he described the characteristics of finance capital and how it differed from industrial capital. But this wasn't what he wrote about in volume 1. In volume 1, he wrote about the relations between labor and its employers, the capitalists. And he said, well, prior to 1848 and the revolutions in Europe, most people thought landlords were parasites, were predatory, the idle rich, and they thought that bankers were predatory. They didn't think that employers were exploitative. Industrialists gave work, and what Marx showed was that wage labor was itself a form of exploitation that the other earlier economists had not discussed. And it was Marx that added to classical economics. On the one hand, the analysis of the exploitation of wage labor by its employers, and on the other hand, the exploitations of the feudal society. And Marx believed, well, if you're going to project the future, what do? You expect every class to act in its own self-interest. So Marx helped found the International Working Men's Association, and it sought to support labor's interest to get higher wages and better working conditions, shorter working hours, pensions, health care, we know that. But more important, and what is often ignored, is that Marx thought that industrial capital would act in its self-interest, and industrial capital had as its political program getting rid of the landlords and essentially industrializing and then socializing banking. And by the time Marx wrote in the 1870s, almost everybody writing about the future called it socialism. There was Christian socialism, there was Ricardian socialism from John Stuart Mill, Tax the Land, there was Henry George with the land tax, there was libertarian anarchist socialism, there was Marxian socialism. From about the 1880s until World War I, almost all of the world was debating what kind of socialism would we have. Nobody expected capitalism to simply remain a market, the way that things are organized. Everybody was talking about how do we change the kind of things that are in the market? How do we take the land rent out of the market? How do we get interest out of the market? And Marx said the industrialists had an interest in this because the industrialists wanted to undersell their competitors in other countries and at home. And how did an industrialist make money? Marx said by reducing the price of their products relative to their competitors. And there are two ways of reducing price. One is to reduce wages, which is the class war between capital and labor. But even larger in terms of statistical terms is a class war of industry against landlords and against the banks. Things have not turned out that way, basically since about 1980. And again, you remember Professor Romer said the big change occurred with Ronald Reagan in the United States. Almost all of the trends of distribution of wealth and income were stable until about 1980. And then they went off the tracks. All of a sudden since then, there's been a great polarization, and a number of things happened in 1980. It wasn't simply Ronald Reagan. You had in 1980 a steady rise of interest rates from the end of World War II, when all the governments kept their interest rates low. You had a steady rise as economies grew and recovered, and especially the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War distorted American capitalism and the American economy and created a crisis because the incomes were paid to workers not to produce their own consumer goods and not even to produce capital goods, but produce military goods, the military-industrial complex. This created such a crisis that interest rates rose to 20% for prime corporate borrowers at the beginning of 1980. Since 1980, for the last 35 years, you've had a reversal, largely thanks to the fact that the Americans stopped paying for wars in gold. You have interest rates decline all the way to below 1%. You've had in America the largest bond rally in history. In other words, bond prices in the last 35 years have gone up more than any other time in historical records. And when the interest rate goes down, that means that the price of a bond goes up. The result of banks creating money and the central bank fueling an inflation has been that the holders of these bonds and stocks and real estate, with interest rates going down, you can borrow more and more money to buy buildings. And so homes and property have been rising in price because not only of lower interest rates, but because of easier credit. None of this decline in interest rates and the creation of a financial bubble is inherent to industrial capitalism. It's a finance capitalism phenomenon, and it's a phenomenon that Marx discussed in Volume 3. So this brings us back to, I think, where Professor Romer began his talk was citing Piketty's, the statistics on the concentration of wealth and the ratio of wealth to income. But what really is wealth that we're talking about? There are two ways in which people use the word wealth. One is, I'm sure, especially in China and Marxists, you think of the means of production. You think of factories, farms, and things that produce things. But the other kind of wealth is the antithesis, the opposite. It's finance, it's debt. If you have savings, and savings are lent out, then one person's wealth in the form of savings equals another person's debt. So the opposite of wealth is financial debt. And what you've had in all economies, from the United States to Europe, and now I understand also in China, is an increasing rise in debt relative to output, relative to wages. In the United States, the federal government now guarantees the mortgages that banks write. Banks will not write a mortgage these days unless the government promises to buy it if the borrower can't pay. And the rule is that banks are allowed to lend borrowers money up to 43% of their family income. Now, just think of this. If you pay 43% of your income for a mortgage, and you deduct 15% of the paycheck for Social Security and medical care, if you pay another 10 or 15% in taxes, retail taxes and income taxes, and if you pay another 10% to banks for student loans, bank loans, credit card debt, you find that in America, the workers can only really buy about 1/4 of what they earn on goods and services. 3/4 of what a wage earner earns in America goes to pay either the banks or the real estate owners or the government for taxes that have been shifted off wealth onto labor. And I won't get into the technicalities, of how the taxes on labor have been increased, but people didn't used to have to pay Social Security taxes of more than 3 or 4%. It's a disguised form of taxation. When the American income tax was introduced in 1913, only 1% of the population had to fill out a tax form. 99% didn't have to pay the tax. And most important, capital gains. The increase in the price of property, the increase in stock prices, and the increase in bond prices is not taxed. And all of a sudden, you have something that nobody talked about in classical economics, and even Marx did not expect that capitalism would become so untracked that by far most of the money that's been made, most of the wealth that's been accumulated, is accumulated in the form of the rising price of real estate. 80% of bank loans in America are to real estate, and a home is worth whatever a bank will lend. So if prices here in China are rising for your housing, it's because the banks are lending people the money to buy a house. Because you certainly, by the time you start a family, you certainly don't have enough money to buy the house for all cash. You have to get the money from borrowing from a bank. And if a bank lends more and more money, the price is going to go up. In America, for many years, the typical mortgage was 30 years. This means that the wage earner in America has to spend 30 years of his life paying for the house that he lives in. And he also has to spend maybe 10 or 20 years of his life paying for the education. And then he has to keep on borrowing and going more into debt just to maintain a standard of living when his wages do not go up, and all of these taxes and goods and service prices go up more and more. So what we're seeing in America and Europe is a monopolization of the economy and a financialization. It's the new word that was added to the English language a few years ago. Financialization means turning real estate and factories into a way of making money. The heads of industrial companies in America are not engineers. They're basically financial engineers. And they use the word in English, financial engineering. And it's obviously not industrial engineering. It's not engineering to produce goods and services that people use. It's simply a way of increasing stock by using profits not to reinvest, to employ more labor, to produce more goods and services, which is what Marx described industrial capitalism as doing. If you make more profits, you either pay them out as dividends, you do just exactly what the British were doing and were criticized for before World War I, or you use the profits to borrow even more money to buy the stock, or you borrow to take over another country. So what we have is a completely new phenomenon. It's not a form of equilibrium. It's a steady deterioration. And I agree with what Professor Ullman said and what he will say after I talk, that we are in something like a final crisis of capitalism, because in every country, in Europe and the United States, there is no means of paying the volume of debt that has been run up. I think Samar Amin today mentioned Greece. There's no way that Greece can pay the amount of money that it's owed. And so the European Central Bank said, okay, we know you can't pay. Here's what you have to do. You have to sell off 50 billion euros of your property. Give us your land. Give us your islands. Give us your oil rights in the Aegean Sea. Give us the Parthenon. Give us your electric utility. Give us your port. You have to sell it all off to pay your debts. So the crisis today is not so much a crisis simply of workers earning enough more to pay their debts. If workers do get more salary in the United States, when they move into the middle class, the price of entry into the middle class in the United States is to go so deeply into debt to buy your own house, to buy an education to get a job, to buy a car to drive to your job, all on debt, that you have to work for the rest of your life paying off the bank. So on top of the exploitation of the employer that Marx talked about in Volume 1 is the exploitation of the creditors, the bankers, that he spoke about in World War III. And what do the bankers want? They want to foreclose on the public infrastructure, on the roads, the transport system, the airlines, the water systems, everything that you have. Well, already 100 years ago, the mayor of Cleveland, Ohio, one of the industrial cities of America at that time, won election because he said he wanted to build a public electric utility to produce low electric prices. He said if the public doesn't own the electric utility, then the utility will own the public. And he said to voters, if you don't own the electric company, the company will own you. Well, a few years ago, later mayor of Cleveland, Dennis Kucinich, who was one of the presidential candidates 8 years ago, said when he was elected mayor of Cleveland, and the banks came to him, and they said, we want you to privatize the utility. If you can privatize the utility, we will raise the prices fourfold. We will make a 400% capital gain, and we'll make you governor. If you act for the banks, we'll make you governor. And who knows where you'll go from there. And he said, I'm not going to do it. I'm going to keep electricity prices low for Cleveland. And that's ended up basically the plank on which he ran for president. It may be surprising, but if you look at the classical debates that Marx described, they usually talk about three factors of production: land, labor, and capital. What they don't talk about is the largest capital investment of all, and that's public enterprise. That's the government investment in roads, transportation, your school system, everything that is produced for free. And the objective of government infrastructure is not to make it part of the market, not to make a profit, but to lower the cost of living and to lower the cost of doing business for the population. Now, this is why the United States government in 1945, when World War II ended, was afraid of socialism. It was afraid of letting Russia into the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank because it said socialist countries are unfair, they can undersell us. If you have public roads, public utilities, you don't have to charge interest. You don't have to charge rent. You don't have to charge a high price. You can charge a low price or give the transportation for nothing. You don't have to pay high executive salaries and dividends. And so they said they worried, strange as it seems now, that socialist countries could outcompete. And that analysis is still applicable to China today. What you're threatened with from the West is not so much Western industry coming and buying and helping you develop, but adopting the practices of Western finance, the practice of Western banking and privatization. To the extent that you let private bankers create money, they will create it for nothing on a computer keyboard electronically. You don't need a private banker to do this. And if you let the private bankers here to do the banking and lend the credit, they're not going to lend credit to build factories. They're not going to lend credit to help employ you. They're going to lend credit for people to buy other infrastructure, to buy other factories, to lend to the government, and then tell the Chinese government, oh no, you have to begin selling things off. And you can look at what's happening in Greece as a dress rehearsal of what can go wrong. So the common denominator between what Bertel, Ullman, and I are talking about is there is a final crisis of capitalism now. Bertel focuses on mechanization, replacing workers, and I'm focusing on what happens even if the workers are employed. They're being the workers and their companies are being stripped by finance capitalism run wild. You've seen what happened when the Soviet Union collapsed. Professor Romer said, well, they adopted capitalism. They did not adopt capitalism. They adopted the opposite of Western capitalism. None of the oligarchs in Russia spent their money building new factories. They spent their money taking control of factories and selling them to the West that closed them down and turned them into real estate projects. That should be, Russia's experience should be an object lesson for what to avoid if you're a country that has so little background in Marxism that you don't even know what finance capitalism is all about. And I hope what we do today is to give you the warnings of what not to do, not to accept from the West, because what passes for economics in the West is not simply a rejection of Marxism, it's a rejection of Adam Smith, Mill, and the classical economics that everybody held in the 19th century. There's been a rewriting of history to expurgate the whole kind of analysis that we are all here together trying to develop at this meeting.